The call came at 3:47 a.m., that hollow hour when even hospital corridors hold their breath. I was halfway through my night shift at St. Mary's Memorial when Sandra, my stepfather Richard's caregiver, left a voicemail that would shatter the careful architecture of my life. "Caitlin, it's Richard. You need to come now." Those 6 words carried the weight of 15 years of complicated history between us. 15 years since he'd married my mother, 10 since her death, and now, standing in the fluorescent-lit break room with my phone pressed against my ear, I felt the familiar twist of obligation and resentment in my gut. "Dr. Harrison, can you cover for me?" I asked my supervisor, already untying my scrubs. "Family emergency." The words tasted bitter, like copper pennies on my tongue. Family. As if that word hadn't become a battlefield of expectations and disappointed hopes. The drive to Richard's sprawling Victorian home on the outskirts of Millbrook felt endless. Each mile marker ticked past like a countdown to something I couldn't quite name. My son Tyler's school picture smiled at me from the dashboard, 8 years old, gap-toothed, and blissfully unaware of the complexities that came with being an adult. Being a single mother. Being me. When I pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar black Mercedes parked in Richard's usual spot. The porch light cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and through the bay window, I could see figures moving inside. One of them I recognized immediately, my stepbrother Evan, Richard's only biological child and the golden boy of the family. The sight of him made my shoulders tense. We hadn't spoken since last Christmas, when he'd made pointed comments about my life choices over dinner. Sandra met me at the door, her usually pristine uniform wrinkled, dark circles under her eyes. "He's gone," she whispered, and those 2 words hit me like a physical blow. "About an hour ago. Evan's already called the lawyer." Of course he had. That was Evan, always 3 steps ahead, always calculating. I pushed past Sandra, my nurse's instincts taking over as I headed for Richard's study. The room smelled of leather and expensive cigars, just like always, but now there was an underlying sweetness of decay that made my stomach turn. Evan stood by the mahogany desk, his suit as immaculate as ever, phone pressed to his ear. When he saw me, his lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'll call you back," he said to whoever was on the line. "The help has arrived." "I'm family, Evan," I said, the words automatic, rehearsed from years of defending my place in this house. "Are you?" His voice was silk over steel. That's an interesting perspective, considering recent developments. Before I could respond, a man I didn't recognize stepped out of the shadows. He wore an expensive suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Ms. Thompson. I'm James Whitman, your stepfather's attorney. There are some matters we need to discuss." The way he said it, careful, measured, sent a chill down my spine. Behind him, Evan's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Richard made some changes to his will," Whitman continued, "just last week, in fact. Very significant changes." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Last week? Richard had been barely conscious, lost in a morphine haze. How could he have changed his will? "I don't understand," I said, but the look that passed between Evan and the lawyer told me I was the only one in the room who didn't. Sandra appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands. "Caitlin, there's something else you should know." She glanced nervously at Evan, who gave her a sharp nod. "Your stepfather, he was lucid that day. He asked specifically for the lawyer. And he mentioned something about making things right." Making things right. The phrase echoed in my head like a warning bell. In my pocket, my phone buzzed, probably the hospital wondering where I was, when I'd be back. But standing there in Richard's study, surrounded by the ghosts of family secrets and the predatory smile of my stepbrother, I knew I wouldn't be going back tonight. Or maybe ever. Because in that moment, I saw something on Richard's desk that changed everything, a familiar leather-bound journal, its pages dog-eared and yellowing. My mother's diary. The one she'd kept locked away, the one that disappeared after her death. And poking out from between its pages was a photograph I'd never seen before, my mother, much younger, standing next to a man who wasn't Richard or my father. The look on Evan's face told me he knew exactly what that diary contained. And he was ready for war. "Shall we begin?" Whitman asked, opening his briefcase with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I squared my shoulders, feeling the weight of my mother's secrets pressing against my chest like a stone. "Yes," I said, meeting Evan's cold stare. "Let's begin." The contents of Richard's will crash through my world like a wrecking ball, demolishing every foundation I thought I could trust. I sat in Whitman's leather-bound office the next morning, watching dust motes dance in the sunlight while my stepfather's last words reduced my future to ashes. "The entire estate, with the exception of a small trust for your son's education, has been left to Evan Thompson." Whitman's voice droned on, clinical and detached, as if he weren't dismantling 15 years of promises. "The changes were made legally and with sound mind, witnessed by 2 independent parties. The numbers swam before my eyes, millions in properties, investments, art collections. All of it redirected from the equal split Richard had promised to a complete disinheritance." My fingers traced the edge of my mother's diary, hidden in my bag like a loaded gun. I'd stayed up all night reading its early entries, each page revealing shadows I'd never known existed in our family's history. "This is impossible," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Richard promised my mother before she died that Tyler and I would be taken care of. He swore to her. Promises to the dead hold no legal weight, Ms. Thompson." Whitman's smile was practiced, professional, empty. "And speaking frankly, given certain information that came to light in Richard's final days, he felt this arrangement was more appropriate." Information. The word hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. In my bag, my mother's diary seemed to pulse with unspoken truths. Last night's entries still burned behind my eyes, meeting with Marcus again. He doesn't know, can never know. Richard's offer solves everything, but at what cost? Marcus. A name that appeared throughout the diary's pages with increasing frequency. A man whose shadow loomed larger with each entry, until suddenly, nothing. As if he'd been erased not just from the pages, but from our entire family history. "I'll contest it," I said, leaning forward. Richard was heavily medicated. He wasn't in his right mind. I have medical affidavits proving otherwise. Evan's voice cut through the room as he entered, uninvited and unwelcome. He'd changed suits, I noticed absurdly. Always immaculate, always perfect. The doctors confirmed his lucidity during the signing. "Face it, Caitlin, you've lost." The satisfaction in his voice ignited something in me, not just anger, but a cold, calculating fury I'd never known I possessed. "Why were you there, Evan? When Richard changed the will? What did you tell him?" His smile flickered, just for a moment. "I was protecting our family's interests." "Our family?" I laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut. "Since when have you considered me family? Was it family interests you were protecting when you tried to have Tyler's trust removed too?" Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Thompson, perhaps we should dash." "No." Evan's mask slipped further, revealing something ugly beneath. "She needs to understand her position. Richard knew the truth, Caitlin. About everything. About your mother, about Marcus Palmer, about Dash." He stopped abruptly, but the damage was done. Marcus Palmer. The name hit me like a physical blow. I'd seen it in my mother's diary, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. Made the impossible suddenly, terrifyingly possible. "Who is Marcus Palmer?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The look that passed between Evan and Whitman told me everything and nothing. "I think we're done here," Evan said, straightening his tie. "The will is clear. You have 48 hours to vacate the guest house before I list it for sale. I stood slowly, gathering my bag, feeling the weight of the diary inside it. You know what your mistake is, Evan? You think this is about money. I met his eyes, seeing the flicker of uncertainty there. It's not. It's about truth. And I'm going to find it, no matter what it costs. Be careful, Caitlin, he called as I reached the door. Some truths are better left buried. For everyone's sake. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. My mother taught me something before she died. She said that buried truths are like buried seeds, they don't die. They grow. They push through concrete, through foundations, through everything we build to keep them hidden. And when they finally break through. I turned back, seeing the first real fear in Evan's eyes. They destroy everything in their path. The door clicked shut behind me with the finality of a judge's gavel. In my bag, my phone buzzed, a text from Sandra, found something in Richard's study. Something about Marcus Palmer. Come quickly. My hands shook as I read the message. Outside Whitman's office, Oakland's financial district hummed with morning traffic, but I barely heard it over the roaring in my ears. Because now I knew, the diary wasn't just a record of the past. It was a map to a truth so dangerous that someone had killed to keep it hidden. And based on the look I'd seen in Evan's eyes, he knew exactly what that truth was. I pulled out my mother's diary, turning to the last entry I'd read, if Caitlin ever finds out the truth about her father. The rest of the page was torn out, but it didn't matter. The pieces were already falling into place, forming a picture that would either save me or destroy me completely. The choice was mine. And I chose war. The drive back to Richard's house felt like navigating through the fragments of my own shattered identity. Each turn of the wheel brought me closer to a truth I both craved and feared, while my mother's diary sat beside me like a ticking bomb. The morning sun caught the leather binding, and for a moment, I saw my reflection fractured across its worn surface, a kaleidoscope of the woman I'd been and the warrior I was becoming. Sandra was waiting on the front steps, her usual composed demeanor replaced by something that looked unsettlingly like fear. She clutched a manila envelope to her chest as if it were a shield, her knuckles white against the yellow paper. "We need to talk somewhere private," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder at the house that now belonged to Evan. "Not here. They've already changed the locks, but they don't know about the greenhouse." The greenhouse had been my mother's sanctuary, a glass cathedral of orchids and secrets tucked away at the edge of the property. As we picked our way through the overgrown path, memories flooded back, my mother tending to her plants, speaking to them in hushed tones as if they were confidants in some vast conspiracy I was too young to understand. Now, standing among the ghost of her beloved blooms, I realized perhaps they had been exactly that. "I found these hidden in Richard's study," Sandra said, pulling several documents from the envelope. "Behind the false bottom of his desk drawer. He showed me where they were kept, made me promise to get them to you if anything happened to him before he could tell you himself." My hands trembled as I took the papers, each page feeling like it carried the weight of an avalanche. The first was a letter, dated just days before Richard's death, written in his familiar, architectural hand. "My dearest Caitlin. By the time you read this, the poison will have done its work. Yes, poison, not the cancer everyone believes is killing me. I know who's responsible, just as I know the truth about your heritage. The same truth that's been eating away at our family like acid for 30 years. Marcus Palmer wasn't just your mother's lover. He was my business partner, and the man who nearly destroyed everything I built. The money he paid for my silence, your mother never knew the full price of that silence. But now you must." The letter blurred before my eyes, tears or shock or both rendering the words into meaningless shapes. Sandra's hand found my shoulder, steadying me as the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. "There's more," she said softly. "Bank records. Letters between Richard and Marcus Palmer spanning decades. And this," She hesitated, then pulled out a photograph I'd never seen before. My mother, young and radiant, standing in a garden I didn't recognize. Her hand rested protectively over her stomach, over me, while Marcus Palmer stood behind her, his expression a mirror of the love in hers. Richard knew, I whispered, the pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. He knew I wasn't his stepchild at all. I was the daughter of the man who betrayed him. Sandra nodded, her eyes filled with a sympathy that threatened to break me. But that's not all he knew. The transfers of money, the threats, they went both ways. Richard was blackmailing Marcus Palmer too, using you as leverage. And Evan. Evan was helping him. The greenhouse suddenly felt too small, its glass walls pressing in like the truth itself was trying to suffocate me. I sank onto my mother's old potting bench, the wood creaking beneath the weight of revelation. Why tell me now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The universe has a cruel way of timing its revelations. Because Evan's not just trying to take your inheritance, Sandra replied, pulling one final document from the envelope. He's trying to erase you completely. Look at the date on Richard's new will, it was drafted the day after he confronted Evan about the poison. The day after he threatened to tell you everything. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Richard hadn't changed his will out of spite or rejection. He'd done it as his final move in a game I was only now beginning to understand. A game where I wasn't just a pawn, but the queen hidden in plain sight. My phone buzzed, a text from Molly, my oldest friend, need to see you. It's about Marcus Palmer. I've been keeping something from you for years. I looked up at Sandra, seeing in her eyes the same realization that was crystallizing in my own heart. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. It was about murder, betrayal, and a web of lies so intricate that pulling any single thread threatened to unravel not just my world, but everyone connected to it. What will you do? Sandra asked, but her tone suggested she already knew. I stood, gathering the documents with hands that no longer shook. The fragments of my old self lay scattered among the wilting orchids, but from their ashes rose something harder, colder, more dangerous. A woman forged in the crucible of betrayal. I'm going to see Molly, I said, my voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. And then I'm going to burn Evan's whole world down, one secret at a time. As I left the greenhouse, the morning sun caught its glass panels, throwing rainbow fractals across the overgrown path. Each step felt like crossing a threshold, moving from the woman who sought approval to the one who would demand justice. Behind me, my mother's orchids stood witness, their wilted blooms a testament to the beautiful lies that had nourished our family for 3 decades. Those lies were about to die. And from their decay, something far more potent would grow, the truth, in all its vengeful glory. The Copper Rose Cafe had been our sanctuary for 15 years, mine and Molly's. We'd weathered divorces, deaths, and countless personal storms within its brick walls, our friendship seemingly as permanent as the coffee stains on the worn wooden tables. But as I watched her through the window, fidgeting with her wedding ring, I felt the ground shifting beneath another fundamental truth of my life. The bell above the door chimed my entrance like a warning. Molly's face, usually warm and open as a summer sky, was drawn tight with guilt, a canvas stretched too far, threatening to tear. The sight sent ice through my veins, despite the steam rising from her untouched latte. How long have you known? I asked, settling into my usual chair. No hello, no preamble. We were past such niceties now. Molly's fingers trembled against her cup, leaving fingerprints on the ceramic like evidence at a crime scene. Since the beginning, she whispered, each word falling between us like stones into still water. Your mother, she made me promise. She said knowing would destroy you. The irony of those words tasted bitter on my tongue. And this doesn't destroy me. Finding out that my best friend has been part of the conspiracy. That every conversation we've had about my father, about Richard, about my place in that family, it was all built on lies you helped maintain. It wasn't like that, Molly protested, but her voice held the hollow ring of rehearsed justification. Marcus Palmer came to me 6 years ago. He wanted to know about you, about Tyler. He was dying, Caitlin. He wanted to make things right before. 6 years? The words escaped me in a whisper that felt like ground glass. My son's entire life, you've known his true grandfather was alive. That he was reaching out. The magnitude of this betrayal expanded like a supernova in my chest, consuming everything in its path. Evan was paying me, she continued, tears now falling freely. Every month, to keep track of you, to report any signs you might be discovering the truth. I thought. I told myself I was protecting you. That the money was helping me provide for my kids after Tom left. The cafe's ambient noise faded to a distant hum as memories rearranged themselves like pieces of a treacherous puzzle. Every coffee date where she'd probed about my stepfather's health. Every supposedly coincidental run-in with Evan after our conversations. Every sympathetic nod when I'd confided my suspicions. The day my mother died, I said, my voice carrying a deadly calm that surprised even me, you held me while I cried. You told me that at least I had Richard, that he was the father figure I deserved. All while knowing. I was trying to give you peace. Molly reached for my hand, but I withdrew it as if her touch might burn. Marcus Palmer wasn't just your father, he was the man who nearly destroyed Richard's company. The scandal would have ruined everyone, including your mother. Richard's silence came with a price, and that price was you. Your mother agreed to marry him, to let him raise you as his own, in exchange for keeping Marcus's fraud quiet. The truth landed like a physical blow, forcing the air from my lungs. And what was your price, Molly? What was the exact dollar amount of our friendship? She slid an envelope across the table, her hand shaking. Everything's here. Account numbers, dates, recordings of conversations with Evan. Marcus Palmer's private number, he's still alive, Caitlin. And he's been waiting for you. I stared at the envelope, seeing it not as paper and ink but as a detonator to the life I'd known. Why now? Why tell me all this when you've kept the secret for so long? Because Richard's death wasn't natural, Molly whispered, glancing nervously around the cafe. Evan, he found out Richard was planning to tell you everything. About Marcus, about the company, about the real reason your mother died. Her voice caught, and in that hesitation, I heard the sound of another bomb waiting to drop. What about my mother? Her car accident. It wasn't an accident at all. And I can prove it. Molly's voice cracked. I've been gathering evidence for years, telling myself it was insurance in case Evan ever turned on me. But really, I think I was waiting. Waiting for the moment when keeping these secrets would destroy more than revealing them. The world tilted on its axis, reality reorganizing itself around this new gravitational center of truth. My mother's death, the single event that had shaped the last decade of my life, had been orchestrated. And everyone, even my closest friend, had been complicit in hiding it. I stood slowly, gathering the envelope and my shattered illusions. You know what the worst part is, Molly? Not the lies, not even the betrayal. It's that you watched me build my entire life on a foundation of quicksand, and you said nothing. You watched me sink, year after year, all while holding the rope that could have pulled me to solid ground. Caitlin, please, the desperation in her voice might once have moved me. Now it felt like another manipulation, another performance in a play where I'd never known my true role. I'm going to see Marcus Palmer, I said, my voice carrying the weight of inevitable confrontation. And then I'm going to dismantle everything Evan has built, brick by blood-stained brick. The question is, Molly, when the dust settles, which side of the ruins do you want to be standing on? I left her there, sobbing into her cold latte, the bell's cheerful chime a discordant note in the symphony of destruction I was orchestrating. Outside, Oakland's afternoon sun cast my shadow long and dark across the sidewalk, no longer the shadow of a victim, but of an avenger. My phone buzzed, an unknown number, but I knew instinctively who it was. The message was simple, devastating in its implications: I've waited 30 years to meet my daughter. But be careful, Evan knows you're coming. And he's already moved against Tyler. My son's name on that screen ignited something primal, something that transcended revenge and entered the realm of pure, maternal warfare. Evan had just made his final mistake. He'd threatened the one pure thing in my web of lies, and in doing so, he'd sealed his fate. The game was no longer about inheritance or truth. It was about survival. And I was done playing by their rules. The text about Tyler's safety burned in my mind like acid as I drove through the gathering dusk toward Marcus Palmer's estate. Each mile marker ticked past like a countdown to revelation, while my son slept safely at my neighbor's house, surrounded by the private security team I'd hired with the last of my savings. The weight of my mother's diary pressed against my ribs from its place in my jacket pocket, a constant reminder of how truth could be both weapon and wound. Marcus Palmer's home rose from the Berkeley Hills like a modernist's dream of glass and steel, its windows reflecting the dying sun in shades of blood and gold. As I pulled into the circular drive, my headlights caught a figure standing in the doorway, tall, distinguished, with my mother's eyes staring back at me from a stranger's face. The recognition hit me with physical force, a genetic memory awakening in my bones. "You have her walk," he said as I approached, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of silence. That same way of moving through the world as if it might shatter if you step too heavily. The observation struck something raw and tender within me, a cord of inherited trauma I hadn't known existed until this moment. "And you have my son's smile," I replied, watching the impact of those words ripple across his features. The one I always wondered about, since it never matched Richard's photos or my mother's expressions. He gestured me inside, each movement carefully measured, like a man who'd rehearsed this moment countless times but now found the script inadequate. The interior of his home was a museum of absence, pristine furniture, untouched books, and everywhere, carefully framed photographs of me taken from a distance. My graduation. My wedding. Tyler's birth announcement in the local paper. A gallery of stolen moments that transformed my past into a curated exhibition of surveillance. "You've been watching us," I said, the realization settling like frost across my skin. "All these years, you've been protecting you," he finished, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into crystal glasses that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "The only way I could, given the circumstances." Protecting me? The laugh that escaped me held no humor, only the sharp edges of decades of abandonment. "By leaving me in that house. By letting Richard and Evan orchestrate my entire life while you collected photos like some sort of distant anthropologist studying his own flesh and blood." Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he offered me a glass. "You don't understand the complexity of what happened back then. The choices your mother and I were forced to make." "Then make me understand," I cut in, my voice carrying a steel edge that surprised us both. "Because right now, my son's life has been threatened, my stepfather has been murdered, and I'm standing in a stranger's house looking at a wall of photos that prove I've never had a single moment of genuine privacy in my entire life. So please, enlighten me about the complexity of it all." He sank into a leather chair that probably cost more than my car, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "Richard and I built Palmer Thompson Industries from nothing. But in '92, we took on some investors who weren't exactly legitimate. Your mother was our corporate counsel. She discovered irregularities, money laundering on a massive scale. But by then, she was already pregnant with you." The truth began to unspool like a thread pulled from a fraying tapestry. "Richard found out about us," Marcus continued, "about you. He offered your mother a deal: he would marry her, claim you as his stepdaughter, and keep both of us safe from the investors who would have killed us all to keep their secrets buried. In exchange, I had to disappear, sign over my shares, and let him transform the company into a legitimate enterprise. And my mother's death? The question hung between us like smoke, toxic and suffocating. Marcus's face crumpled, age and grief etching deeper lines around his eyes. She was gathering evidence, preparing to expose everything. Richard and Evan, they found out. The brake lines in her car weren't an accident. But by then, my hands were tied. The only way I could keep you safe was to stay away, to watch from a distance, to build a network of protection you never knew existed. Like Molly. The piece clicked into place with devastating clarity. She was originally my informant, before Evan turned her. He reached for a laptop, typing rapidly. But she was just one thread in a tapestry of surveillance and counter-surveillance. Richard thought he'd won, thought he'd buried all his secrets. But I've spent 30 years documenting everything, every transaction, every threat, every move they made against us. And now, the screen filled with financial records, emails, surveillance photos, an arsenal of digital warfare that could bring down not just Evan, but the entire empire Richard had built on the foundation of our family's destruction. Why show me this now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because Evan's not just trying to erase your inheritance, he's trying to erase all evidence of what really happened. The poison in Richard's system? It was meant to look like cancer, but it was engineered to be untraceable. The same compound they used in several other unfortunate accidents over the years. And now that Richard's dead, Evan's planning to clean house. Starting with Tyler, I whispered, the name catching in my throat like broken glass. Marcus nodded grimly. You have a choice to make, Caitlin. You can take this evidence to the authorities, watch the whole house of cards collapse from a safe distance. Or. His smile was cold, calculated, a mirror of the expression I'd seen growing on my own face these past few days. Or we can do this the way Richard and Evan would. From the inside. Quietly. Completely. But that path, it will change you in ways you can't imagine. I looked at the wall of photos, at the stranger's face that carried half my genetic code, at the evidence of a lifetime of calculated observation and patient waiting. And in that moment, I felt the last pieces of my old self, the trusting nurse, the hopeful daughter, the woman who believed in justice rather than vengeance, crumble away like ash. Show me everything, I said, setting down the untouched whiskey. Every account, every shell company, every pressure point we can exploit. Because Evan just made this about my son. And I'm going to make him regret the day he ever underestimated a mother's capacity for warfare. Marcus's smile widened, proud and predatory. Then let's begin your real inheritance, daughter. The art of calculated destruction. Outside, the sun finally set, plunging the Berkeley hills into darkness. But in that room, surrounded by the evidence of 3 decades of patient revenge, a new fire was igniting, one that would burn away the last bridges to my past and illuminate a path forward that was as terrifying as it was necessary. Because some truths don't set you free. They arm you for battle. The morning of the shareholders' meeting dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a storm. I stood before the mirror in my mother's old bedroom, watching myself transform one final time. The silk blouse I wore, bought with Marcus's money, felt like armor against my skin, each pearl button ammunition in the war I was about to wage. My reflection showed me a woman I barely recognized, someone forged in the crucible of betrayal and tempered by the fierce heat of maternal rage. The board members are already gathering, Marcus murmured from the doorway, his presence both foreign and familiar, like a ghost given flesh by the power of long-buried truth. Evan's people are nervous. They can smell blood in the water, even if they don't know it's their own yet. I touched my mother's diary, now resting in my briefcase alongside the digital weapons we'd spent a week preparing. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence had been choreographed for maximum devastation. The truth, I'd learned, was not just a revelation, it was a precision-guided missile when deployed correctly. Tyler's safe. The question emerged like a prayer, though I already knew the answer. My son was on a private jet to Switzerland with a security team that answered only to Marcus. The ultimate insurance policy against Evan's desperation. Safer than anyone in that boardroom is about to be, Marcus assured me, his smile carrying the weight of 3 decades of patient vengeance. Are you ready? Ready. Such a simple word for such a complex metamorphosis. The woman who had walked into his house a week ago, broken, betrayed, burning with directionless rage, had been dismantled and reassembled into something altogether more lethal. Every night spent poring over financial records, every revelation about the true scope of Evan's crimes, every piece of evidence linking him to not just Richard's murder but my mother's accident, they had all been transformed into arrows in my quiver, waiting to find their marks. I was born ready, I replied, the words tasting like ash and triumph on my tongue. I just didn't know it until now. The Palmer-Thompson Industries boardroom stretched before us like a gladiatorial arena, all mahogany and malice beneath the sterile fluorescent lights. Evan stood at the head of the table, his confidence radiating like heat waves across the assembled shareholders and board members. His smile flickered when he saw me, just for a moment, but long enough to reveal the first crack in his facade. This is a closed meeting, he began, but I was already moving, my heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. Actually, I said, my voice carrying the kind of authority that only comes from absolute certainty, this meeting is exactly where I belong. As the majority shareholder of Palmer-Thompson Industries. The room erupted in murmurs as I connected my laptop to the presentation screen. Evan's laugh held an edge of desperation. I think you're confused, dear sister. The will was quite clear. The will was a fiction, I cut in, just like everything else you've built your empire on, Evan. Would you like to explain to the board about the offshore accounts? About the money laundering that didn't stop with Richard's legitimization of the company? Or should we start with the more personal matters, like how you arranged my mother's accident when she threatened to expose you? The blood drained from his face as documents began filling the screen, bank statements, email chains, surveillance photos. The evidence of 3 decades of corruption unfurling like a poisonous flower. This is absurd, he sputtered, but the board members were already leaning forward, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning horror. These documents are clearly fabricated. Like the medical records showing Richard's cancer was actually arsenic poisoning. I advanced the presentation. Or like the shell companies you used to funnel money to my best friend to spy on me for 15 years. The beauty of patience, Evan, is that it gives truth time to ripen. To develop roots so deep that when it finally breaks the surface, it brings everything else up with it. One of the board members, a woman who'd known my mother, gasped as the medical examiner's report appeared on screen. Another reached for his phone, fingers trembling as he dialed what could only be his lawyer. You have no proof, Evan hissed, but his eyes darted toward the exit like a cornered animal. I smiled, feeling the weight of my mother's wedding ring on my finger, the one Marcus had given her, the one she'd kept hidden until her death. That's where you're wrong. I have something better than proof. I have your own words. The recording of his conversation with Richard filled the room, their final argument, captured by the security system Marcus had installed decades ago. Evan's voice, cold and clear, outlining exactly how the poison would mimic cancer's progression. Richard's weak protests about wanting to tell me the truth. The sound of a glass being filled, of Richard's last breaths being bought and paid for with the currency of family betrayal. Did you really think Marcus spent 30 years just watching? I asked softly as Evan's world crumbled around him. That he didn't plan for this exact moment. Every step you took to erase me only brought me closer to my true inheritance, not just the company, but the power to destroy everything you built on the foundation of my mother's death. The boardroom doors burst open as federal agents flooded in, their badges catching the morning light like avenging angel swords. I watched Evan's arrest with a detachment that surprised me, as if I were observing a scene from someone else's life. Perhaps I was. The woman I'd been, the one who sought approval, who believed in family despite evidence to the contrary, had died somewhere between discovering the truth and choosing to wield it as a weapon. Hours later, I stood in Richard's study, my study now, watching the sun set on the empire I'd inherited through blood and strategy. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his presence no longer that of a stranger but of a co-architect in the controlled demolition of our family's lies. "Was it worth it?" he asked quietly. "Becoming this version of yourself?" I touched my mother's diary, thinking of the young woman in those pages who had loved so fiercely, paid so dearly, and kept so many secrets in the name of protection. "I didn't become this person," I replied, watching the last light fade from the gardens where I'd once played, innocent of the shadows gathering at the edges of my world. I unveiled her. Every lie they told, every betrayal they engineered, they were all just layers of facade over who I was always meant to be. My phone buzzed with a message from Switzerland, a photo of Tyler, safe and smiling, unknowing of the war that had been waged in his name. In that moment, I understood my mother's choices with a clarity that felt like absolution. Sometimes love looks like protection. Sometimes protection looks like destruction. And sometimes, the only way to save what matters most is to burn everything else to the ground. "The company is yours now," Marcus said, pouring 2 glasses of the whiskey that had been Richard's favorite. "Along with all its shadows and secrets." I accepted the glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light like trapped fire. "No," I corrected him, "it's ours. Built on blood and lies, rebuilt on truth and vengeance. A better foundation than they ever gave us." Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their light reaching us across vast distances of space and time, just as truth had found its way through the years of silence and subterfuge. I was my mother's daughter, my father's heir, and my son's protector. But most importantly, I was finally, irrevocably, myself. The price of that knowledge had been astronomical. But as I stood in the wreckage of my old life, watching the new one rise from its ashes, I knew it had been worth every penny. Some debts can only be paid in truth. Some truths can only be bought with destruction. And some destructions are really just transformations in disguise.